So a few disclosures. None of these have anything to do with the talk that I'm about to give. I would say in the past, I've been an advisory board member for Telarus and Meteor, both companies that are looking to develop tolerance strategies. Let's see, maybe I can advance this a different way. So what is tolerance? So tolerance is basically unresponsiveness. So the immune system learns to not respond to something. You don't know it, but when you think about it, we all have tolerance right now. We tolerate our pancreas. We tolerate, our hearts. So we have protection against self-antigens, but things that are foreign, bacteria, parasites, neoplastic cells, our immune system responds to. Our immune system sees the kidney as a big tumor or as a big pathogen. And so we're trying to trick the immune system into tolerating that. Now, you could do that by giving so much immunosuppression, lethal radiation. Yes, I won't reject my kidney, but I won't survive. So the goal of tolerance is to induce a very specific unresponsiveness to one foreign thing. You want to maintain responsiveness to everything else. You guys lived through COVID here in New York. You want to get a vaccine and you want that vaccine to work. Dr. Montgomery was on a national TV show saying, hey, I got a transplant. 2 doses of COVID vaccine isn't doing it for me. I need a 3rd dose. And so we don't want to so suppress the immune system globally that it can't respond. So tolerance should be specific. It should be forever. Tolerance for years, not true tolerance. It's not like, well, good, I'm not attacking my pancreas today, but I might in a year. You want it to last. And then the other thing is our way of following the health of a transplanted organ is not perfect, right? You can have a pretty normal creatinine and still have immunologic injury. So in theory, if I was to biopsy an organ from a tolerant patient, it should look normal. It shouldn't have inflammation or ongoing injury. What are the disadvantages of conventional immunosuppression? Well, the beauty of talking later in the day is I don't have to talk about it. Dr. Cohen's already shown you. And you all know this. There are all sorts of things that we would like to avoid, some of which I don't think he did mention are cost. So, and I would say non-compliance, I wasn't laughing so much. I'm reasonably educated. I have access to healthcare. I showed up in New York with none of my medicines. So if any of you has a 10 milligram tablet of lisinopril out there, give me a yell. But I mean, my point is, it's not willful not adherence, just life gets busy. What are the advantages of tolerance? Well, one, you don't take any anti-rejection drugs. So all the side effects that you don't want, all the so-called off-target toxicities, you eliminate. As you say, to get your kidney to survive or your liver to survive, you take a drug and you say, well, I may trade a little hypertension or a little diabetes for a functioning kidney. With tolerance, in theory, you would not do that. You would have a functioning organ and you wouldn't have to take those medications. Certainly, when we start talking about patient-reported outcomes and quality of life, that could improve substantially. It may increase the lifespan of the transplanted organ. You've heard of the kidney for life. That's what tolerance was thought to be, that the kidney would last for the duration of my life. And it could be cheaper. So when you talk about, can it increase the survival of an organ? This is data from Stanford. This is a HLA identical transplant cohort. And you can see here, this is the group that got their tolerance regimen. I'll talk about this in a minute. So they got some pretty heavy treatment up front and then take no immunosuppression. This is the same group of people, also HLA identical, that just got the conventional immunosuppressive regimen. For whatever reason, they didn't get the tolerance regimen. So they're on anti-rejection drugs. And you can see that the kidneys did better in the tolerance group. And this is the same thing, Stanford's group versus all the similar transplants in the country. So it's national data as opposed to their in-house data, shows the same thing. So maybe there is a hope that this could improve survival of transplant kidneys. This is really busy, but if you just look at the bottom, this is from the Massachusetts General Tolerance Study. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So you see graft loss was actually higher here. So that's why this study isn't being done right now. But for the people where it worked, so when it failed and the consequences were serious. But when it worked for those people where they were tolerant, if you see kidney function about the same, but hypertension half as much, hyperlipidemia better, diabetes way better, cancer somewhat better, infections better. So it says that if we can find a way to reproducibly make this work, there may be real advantages as far as the unwanted side effects or comorbidities that come with transplantation medicines. And this simply shows that it can be cost saving. We talked about, no one's going to develop a thing that, costs money, right? No pharmaceutical company is going to say, we're developing a drug and we're going to lose a lot. There are benefits here to transplantation tolerance regimens as they exist right now in terms of lifetime savings. And even here, what's interesting is even people transplanted in their 60s, and now solidly into my 60s, I realize I'm old, I qualify for the senior discount and all that. But even at my age, tolerance would be cheaper than taking anti-rejection medicines by this calculation. So we think we're talking about something new, but I would put it to you that neither xenotransplant nor tolerance is new. This is a paper published in 1975 where some physicians found 6 patients who'd stopped taking their anti-rejection medications and their kidney function was good. And somewhat shockingly, they said, these people may be tolerant and we should not restart their medications. Now, that's not the advice we'd give today necessarily, but tolerance is not a new thing. When it became, with the starting of the immune tolerance, which was a very seriously funded initiative to try to prevent immune injury, be it autoimmune, be it transplant, and to try to create tolerance to improve health, a group of very well-known transplant physicians wrote an article saying, wait a minute here. There's no data to suggest that this is safe. There's no data to suggest it will improve outcomes. And it may encourage people to stop taking their medicines, kind of as Dr. Hardy said, you heard about it. Hey, this person got a transplant and they're not taking their medicines, they're doing, well, maybe I can stop. And so there was a little bit of negativity around the concept of tolerance. So I'm going to change gears for a minute. Tolerance comes in a couple flavors. There's what we call spontaneous tolerance, meaning for whatever reason, I get a transplant and I just don't reject the transplant, even without medications. And then there's induced tolerance, which is, I know spontaneous tolerance is rare, so I'm going to do something to try to reprogram your immune system to accept that organ. So the problem with spontaneous tolerance, as I said, it's rare. It varies by the type of organ transplanted. And there are certain clinical and demographic features that might correlate with it, but it's not very useful, right? If I say only left-handed people born in the month of January have a shot at tolerance, well, I can't change that. And then it comes up also with the concept of propay tolerance, meaning almost tolerance. Sir Roy Collin, a very famous transplant surgeon, first coined this term, meaning I may be tolerant 11 months out of the year, but I might get a viral infection or be exposed to something that will trigger some inflammation that could start a rejection episode. So he advocated a low dose of a single drug, even in people who were tolerant, just to kind of smooth out those periods of risk. So to the people who say tolerance doesn't exist, this is a patient I saw as part of an immune tolerance network study. She was transplanted in 1975. She got treated with prednisone and Imuran, 2, although used at higher doses, and drugs without some of the toxicities of the agents we use now. But she stopped them 6 years after her transplant due to side effects. And I saw her, and when I saw her, it was about 30 years out from her transplant. Her creatinine was 0.9, no proteinuria, and has a biopsy here. I know you guys don't look a lot of histology, but I have to show it because this is a pristine looking biopsy. I mean, we transplant kidneys that don't look this good a year after we put them in. And so I do think that transplant tolerance does exist. This is the natural history of tolerance. It's a very famous group in France collected, I believe it was 27 patients who were not taking anti-rejection drugs. And they tried to say, how are they doing? And they broke it down into different groups. But the red lines basically show how the tolerant patients did, and the black lines, the patients taking anti-rejection drugs. And the important point here is they're doing at least as well, if not better, in terms of the health of their graft. So if the graft is healthy and you don't have to take medicines, I think it, again, makes an argument that transplant tolerance exists. We just don't understand quite how to get there yet. If you have liver transplant, you're in a little better boat in terms of this tolerance phenotype. So livers have always been known to be a little less immunogenic, if you will, than kidneys or pancreases. And so this is a study done by a group originally in Spain, moved to the UK, but they took patients and they carefully screened them. They took biopsies, and is there any inflammation, and is your liver function stable and such? And then they randomized them to either, we're just going to start slowly weaning your drugs, or you're going to stay on your anti-rejection drug. And the group where they weaned I guess it was about half of them were able to come off all their anti-rejection drugs. And you say, well, this is great. The problem is the best predictor of who came off their drugs was how long you'd had your liver. So if you'd had your liver for like 10 years, your chance of coming off was pretty good. If you'd had your liver for a year, not so good. So, it's like once I take all these toxic drugs long enough, I can come off. So it's not really a solution, but it does tell us that the body tends to adapt to the transplanted organ over time. And you all know that because anybody who's had a kidney, realizes that what you get at 2 months in terms of your immunosuppression is more than what you get at 10 years. So the real thing that we want to hear about is induced tolerance. So I come in, I've got a donor, I'm going to get a deceased donor, and you're going to do something to me that's going to allow me to accept that kidney without having to take anti-rejection drugs. So that's what I mean here. And these are mechanisms, and it doesn't matter what these mechanisms are, other than to say that all of us have these mechanisms working in our bodies this very moment. That's why we don't have autoimmunity. So the two major ones are clonal deletion and regulation. So clonal deletion means that my body, we're all making T cells that will attack our bodies, or lymphocytes or immune cells, whatever you want to call them. And our body has a way to filter those out. So everything that I have that sees my pancreas, my thymus, or some component of my body is wiping those cells out, creating a little bit of a hole in my immune repertoire. The other is regulation. Clonal deletion is not perfect. A few cells will escape that can cause an autoimmune disease in me, but my body's developed other cells that turn off the immune response. So the immune response has cells that create injury and cells that dampen that injury. If you think of like a viral hepatitis, virus, if I have hep C, I'm going to have virus in my, prior to treatment, prior to the new treatment, I'll have virus in my liver forever. If my body just keeps wailing on that liver, it's going to kill my liver and I'm going to die. That's not a survival advantage for me. So my body has cells that turn off that immune response. Those are called regulatory cells. So the two strategies to try to induce tolerance are to either delete all the cells that see that new organ, or to put in cells that selectively turn off the response, the immune response, damaging that organ. This is a really busy slide, and I'm going to go through it in painstaking detail. That's what you were worried about, I know. This is simply to say, this looks a lot like a chemotherapeutic approach to a bone marrow transplant. It's got cancer or chemotherapeutic drugs, it's got irradiation, it's got bone marrow transplant, paired with all these other conventional immunosuppressive drugs. But the treatment's all up front with the idea that you get this intensive treatment as you would for bone marrow transplant, and then you wean off the drugs over time. And so what you're banking on here is that this intense early treatment is better for you than lifelong anti-rejection drugs. And I think for the most part, the answer is it is. I'm going to skip this slide for now. This is a study done by a group at Northwestern, then it was licensed under a commercial entity called Tolaris, but they looked at a regimen similar to that. The regimens I've shown you before have only been for HLA identical living donor transplants. So it's helpful for those people, but most of us aren't going to have an HLA identical living donor. And there's some efforts to move that to the haploidentical, which is better, but still not perfect, right? I don't have a haploidentical living donor. So this regimen works with anybody, any living donor. And it shows that overall, there was no difference in patient or graft survival, but that's because those are really good anyway, at least in the intermediate term. It does show better kidney function, though, and fewer complications. So if you look here, you see that the upper two bars are the tolerance group. And so there, their kidney function, and this is eGFR, not creatinine, so this is how well the kidney functions, is actually better than the other group, and it's improving over time, or at least staying very stable. The black line is the group that got the conventional anti-rejection drugs, and you can see, as we would expect, slight deterioration over time. If you look at the bottom, no difference, as I said, in rejection rates, but we've heard rejection rates don't correlate with graft loss. So no difference in rejection rate or graft survival, but benefits in terms of hypertension, hyperlipidemia, things like that. So again, arguing that tolerance can work. And as I say, this works, it's irrespective of HLA matching. So you don't need to have a haploidentical living donor. Now, this has not yet been translated to the setting of deceased organ donation, which, as we know, is more common. So that's a challenge. The other thing is all these interventions are being done at the time of the transplant, right? And people realize that that's a rocky time. You know, we heard about ICU stays and all sorts of things. Wouldn't it be nice to recover from all that and then talk to your doctor and decide if you want to go to the transplant? Right? Oh, and this slide simply shows this is a response to immunization, and it shows that the tolerant patients actually have a better response to vaccines than do the patients getting anti-rejection drugs. So it's not that they're just not able to mount an immune response. This is the status of all those trials. The one bugaboo in this thing is something called graft versus host disease. As I mentioned, all these have something where you're putting donor hematopoietic cells in with the kidney. That's thought to be responsible for the mechanism of clonal deletion, perhaps. And if you get too many of those cells can actually attack me. Now I've got, if you will, almost an autoimmune disease. And so we don't want to trade one immune disease for another. That said, these have been fairly infrequent, actually very infrequent. This is from the group at UCLA. They simply did what I said, which is they took people who had HLA identical transplants, but were getting regular immunosuppression. And as Dr. Cohen said, you can always change your regimen. They did the tolerance-inducing strategy between 1 and 5 years after the living donor transplant and showed in a small number of people, but they've had no real failures, that you can still do it. So that makes it a little more applicable and makes me hope that some of these other regimens could be applied later or in the setting of deceased organ donation. Just a quick plug for regulatory cells. Those are those cells that turn off immune responses I mentioned. And there's a lot of interest in these in autoimmunity and in transplant. This was a very big study that I would say there's a follow-on study coming out. What I took away from this is you can make these cells, you can administer them, they're safe. There's no evidence that they actually, caused tolerance or allowed you to reduce immunosuppression. This is a study in liver transplant, which I said is a little different though, where they took people very early in that first year where they wouldn't expect to be able to be weaned from their drugs. And I think, I forget now, but I want to say it's 7 out of 10 patients with the transfer of these regulatory cells. So you get the cells off and there's different types of regulatory cells, but you expand them, you infuse them, and they were able to wean immunosuppression completely off in a majority of these liver transplant patients. So the regulatory cells are capable of doing something. We just don't know how to use them and whether it will be the same in all settings. The last thing I'll talk about is biomarkers. We talked about that a little bit. You can think about it like a surrogate endpoint or something. A biomarker would be something like creatinine or something like, blood sugar, hemoglobin A1C. It's something that I measure something and it informs me about biological behavior. It might increase my risk or it might diagnose the disease earlier. So intolerance, the problem right now is everything we've talked about is empiric, right? I just kind of start weaning some drugs and see how it goes. Or, I do this tolerance regimen and hope it works. It would be nice if you had a marker that said it will succeed in this person or not this person. Or so far the marker looks good. It's safe to keep going. And we don't really have those. And that's one of the problems. The other thing about biomarkers is they inform you about mechanism. So if I looked in somebody's blood and I said, my gosh, tolerance worked in Dr. Hardy, but he's got 3 times more regulatory cells than Dr. Cohen, I might say regulatory cells are a good thing. I need to boost that population of regulatory cells. So they have a couple of uses. This is from the ITN study we did. When we started this study, B cells, it was a time in transplant where B cells make antibodies. We all know antibodies to our transplant organs are bad. So the goal was to exterminate B cells. That was kind of the thought process. And people went to great lengths to try to come up with things that would dampen B cells or get rid of them. And so much so that when we started this, we didn't even study B cells. We thought they're just harmful, they're bad. Why look at them? And Dr. Suthan pointed out with some of his data that our thinking might have been wrong. So we ended up coming up with 25 patients who'd stopped all drugs, much like the group in France. And what you see is this wasn't a temporary thing. These people had excellent creatinines, on average 1, and they were on average, 20 to 10 to 20 years out from their transplant. They were, what set them apart though, is they were largely Caucasian and they were all really well matched. Those are things that we can't change. So I like showing this just because somebody said it's so confusing. You must think I'm smart if I can understand this. Not necessarily true, but it's a gene expression profile study. And what it showed is that most of the genes that were different between people who were on immunosuppression and those who'd successfully come off were related to B cells. So we started to think B cells are good. It turns out there are some B cells capable of dampening immune responses. Just shows that the signature, the blue line, is the signature of the B cell markers we were interested in. And it shows they don't change over time. That's good, right? Because we don't want them to change over time. If they changed over time and the patient stayed the same, I'd say it's not a very good marker. If they weaned over or fell over time, I'd say, wow, we're losing it, and tolerance is supposed to be permanent. The red line suggests maybe a little bit of improvement in the people getting immunosuppression. They may be moving up more like the tolerant patients, which again fits with the idea that over time our body, comes to a accommodation with the transplanted organ. So then we said, well, that's fine and good in 25 rare patients. So we looked at about 250 patients taking immunosuppression and said, how common is this gene expression profile that we think might correlate with tolerance? It was about 25% of people. Now, that doesn't mean all 25% of people are tolerant and we can wean them off, but it means they may have less immune injury or be less prone to immune injury. So it might tell us something about immunosuppressive management. And somewhere in those, maybe some people who could come off. I think an interesting thing that we didn't expect is the people who had more of these regulatory B cells. That's on we'll just stick with the EGFR on the right. That's the people in the blue. Their kidney function was actually better than the people who didn't have these, arguing that these cells are there. They may not be promoting tolerance, but they may be in some way contributing to less immune injury. I'm going to skip that. I'm just going to say, I think that tolerance is not new. I think it holds great promise. We don't know yet how to get there. There are a lot of groups working in this way. I think it's important for the field, as Dr. Katz said, it's all fine and good for me to say, when these studies went out, the whole goal was, can we induce, can we wean drugs off? And the whole goal was, if I have a therapy and I wean your drugs off and you look okay in 6 months, a year, there we go. And there was no control arm even. Well, how do you know that you're not, through your conditioning doing more damage in the long run? How do I know that quality of life is better? How do I know that longevity of the organ's better? So I think that's where we really struggle right now, knowing how to fit tolerance in, because it's of no use to simply get off drugs if in the end you do worse as far as how you feel or how things go.